I want to thank everybody for coming this morning on relatively short notice. I understand that the Congress is in a mad dash to the door and that there are a whole series of votes, and so Congressman Jones will have to leave for some of those votes fairly quickly. So let me just say that in March of this year, Congressman Walter Jones filed House Concurrent Resolution 107, which simply states that only the U.S. Congress, under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, has the authority to declare war, and that any president who violates this cardinal principle of the Constitution may be subject to impeachment proceedings under Article 2. And of course, this is not just simply a philosophical issue, as important as that is, but this is a very real question as we see events in now Africa as well as the Middle East and elsewhere driving us in the potential direction of a war. And therefore, the role of Congress, as envisioned by the founders, is absolutely pivotal in making sure that we don't rush headlong into a conflict that could lead out of proportion into a general war. There is an extraordinary group of people who've come together here today who have all been extremely outspoken in their concerns. And so what I'd like to do is just turn the floor over to Congressman Jones, who will speak briefly, and then followed by Colonel Wilkerson, Bruce Fein, and Colonel Shaffer. And I may say a few remarks at the end, and there will be time for some questions. So thank you all.
Jeff, thank you very much, and I will be brief because we do have votes in about 10 minutes, but my concern has always been, since we were misled with the intelligence to go into Iraq and all the number of young men and women who have been killed and lost limbs, that Congress needs to come back to what the Constitution says, and that is, if you're going to commit our young men and women to fight and die, you must declare war. Now, there are exceptions. Let's be fair about that. The exceptions being like 9/11, the president must have the authority to make immediate decisions. Hopefully he would consult, or she would consult with Congress at that point. I was one of 20 back in 1999 that went to the federal courts with Tom Campbell when President Clinton bypassed Congress and went in and bombed Kosovo. We went to the federal courts. The federal courts kicked it back out, saying, well, you in Congress have the authority to cut the budget, so therefore you have authority to stop war. Well, then again, and when President Obama decided to go in and bomb Libya, that again brought it to my mind, well, here we go again. Here's an administration that has bypassed Congress, meaning bypassed the Constitution, which is more important than Congress, really. But the Constitution says that you will consult with Congress, you will ask for a declaration of war. And to my knowledge, if he consulted with anyone at the time, it was just 1, 2, or 3 people, maybe in the leadership of the Republican and Democratic Party. So working with Bruce Fein, we put in HCON Resolution 107 that Jeff just mentioned. And it says a president. It does not say the president. It says a president. I wanted that to become a vehicle for debate on war powers. Sadly, as much as we pushed and pushed, we did not get a hearing in this Congress on the role of Congress as it relates to the Constitution and the issue of war. So therefore, today I am delighted to be a small part of this. We continue to hear war drums beating in the Middle East and also in other parts of the world. And all I think should happen is that Congress should follow the Constitution. And there are exceptions, which I've already mentioned. So here today, as Jeff introduced, Colonel Wilkerson and I became friends after I knew I'd made a mistake on the Iraq War. I consulted with Larry Wilkerson, also other people. He helped me understand that too many times there are backroom decisions made by administrations that bypass Congress and the American people and commit this country to war. Bruce Fein is a very dear friend of mine. Again, he's helped me with many of the constitutional issues. I'm not an attorney. I think I understand the Constitution, but I'm not an expert. He is expert. And Colonel Tony Shaffer is the kind of person that he believes integrity and intelligence. He believes that the truth has to guide the policy. So you've got some wonderful people to speak to you, and I'm delighted to be here, and I will continue, if I should get re-elected in November, I will continue to do my part in a very small way to ensure that a kid, an American boy or girl, does not have to give their life unless we follow the Constitution. So with that, thank you so much for giving me a chance to be here today, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I think this, even though it's not massively attended, like many events in our past that were very important, is an important event. And I think Congressman Jones's point, especially in his letter to the President of the United States, is one of the most important points we confront today. And I speak from 31 years of experience at all levels of responsibility in the United States Army and a lot of joint service with particularly the Marine Corps and the United States Navy. I was trained, for example, to think as a strategist at the U.S. Naval War College. We've come to a point in this empire's history that I spend most of my time that's free studying so I can relate it to my students. What we focus on, or what we have come to call, is fateful decision-making by the President. Fateful decision-making we define as decisions made to send young men and young women to die for state purposes. And also, something we often forget, particularly in this country, to kill other people for state purposes. In the last decade, by conservative Pentagon estimates, we have killed over 300,000 people. That's a sobering thought, especially when there is no existential threat to the United States of America whatsoever. Nor is there one in sight, other than perhaps ourselves. Bruce Fein can speak to this a lot better than I, but James Madison, often thought of as the father of our Constitution, often said that to turn the war power over to the executive was tantamount to tyranny. That's precisely what we've done. Precisely what we've done. And why is the executive so eager to have the war power? I've served 3 of them closely. Because they can use it. It is the most facile thing in this country to do. We have ways to get around congressional instincts on the armed forces. We simply deploy 200,000 private military contractors and thereby increase the strength of the land forces by that amount. We have a modern volunteer military that takes less than 1% of America to bleed and die for the other 99%. And when I ask my students, how many of you, I'm going to put you on the spot, how many of you would change places with that Marine or that soldier in Afghanistan, Iraq, or wherever it might be? And I never get a hand. They're at least candid and honest with me. And I tell them those soldiers and those sailors, to a man and to a woman, by and large, would rather be sitting where you're sitting than being where they are. And yet, the President has the power to put them there. The suicide rate in the Army and Marine Corps is off the charts. One of the reasons is because we lowered the requirements so far that we took 100,000 troops who fail psychological examinations multiple times before we put them in the Army or the Marine Corps. It's not the only reason. Deployments, excessive deployments, frequent deployments, a really nasty battlefield, and other things have contributed to that. But we, as Americans, I think, and I am, should be ashamed to have allowed this to happen. And it's all happened because of what Congressman Jones is pointing at. The facility with which the President of the United States can take this apathetic nation to war and kill people. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to also pay homage to Congressman Walter Jones. He reminds me of an observation then President Andrew Jackson made when he was asked, what is a majority? He said, one man with courage. And with Walter Jones, we may have an ability to step back from the precipice. And I would like to pick up and amplify on what Colonel Wilkerson said. Those 300,000 killings are murder, because legal war makes what's customarily murder legal. But if you're not at war legally, those are homicides. And the reason why the Founding Fathers were so intent on having a very exacting standard to enter war is precisely because war is the law of the jungle. Cicero had said 2,000 years before, in times of war, the law is silent. Even the purported laws of war are regularly flouted with virtual impunity. And so the Founding Fathers drew on the history of all of mankind that showed the executive branch was the most inclined to enter war because they get the spending, the appointments, the glory, the footprints in the sands of time. I'm transforming the world. If you look at the history of all human species, it's the executive that invariably initiates the warfare. Sometimes it's for vendettas. I've been told that George W. Bush wanted revenge because of Saddam's effort to kill his father. Once Saddam was captured, he didn't care anymore. Those are exactly the reasons why every single founding father at the Constitutional Convention had said, we do not want any single person or any group of people to enable us to enter war. That ranged from the most liberal to the most conservative, like Alexander Hamilton, who was in favor of a muscular presidency. They all agreed that warfare was irreconcilable with freedom. The principles that are established to justify war, national security, migrate back into the domestic arena. And we've seen it just recently with the National Defense Authorization Act that empowers the president to detain any American citizen on his say-so alone if you provide substantial assistance to an associated force of a terrorist group. And when recently in the Southern District of New York, the United States was asked, what is substantial assistance in the suit brought by Chris Hedges? Oh, we don't know. What's an associated force? We don't know. We'll know it when we see it. That shows you the breadth of the authority that's authorized by the NDAA. That's a migration from the war power usurpation. And indeed, what's very ironic, when we were initially told, we need to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq 6,000, 8,000 miles away to prevent the battlefield from coming home. Those champions of the NDAA said, the battlefield's home. If we capture and detain anyone here, now they don't have any rights to a lawyer. They have no rights to due process. We're telling them that the battlefield here is in the United States. This was the Lindsey Grahams, the Mr. Liebermans, John McCain. Well, we were fighting 6,000, 8,000 miles away to prevent that. Now you've taken the battlefield here. And to even expand beyond that, the most recent disclosures in the New York Times, not at all refuted by the Obama administration, they take pride in it, shows that the president claims and exercises authority to survey every species individual on the planet. If he says you're an imminent danger to the United States, you get vaporized. Predator drone. Any judicial review? No. Any congressional review? No. Any disclosure of the profile, the intelligence that justifies the finding you're one of the terrorists we're going to vaporize? No. All secret. What we call a combination of legislative, executive, judicial power, plus being executioner, all in one man, which the Founding Fathers described in Federalist 47 as the very definition of tyranny. Now think of that. The whole reason we had the Declaration of Independence and fought the War of the American Revolution was what? To end the tyranny of King George III. And now we're practicing exactly what we revolted against some 225, 230 years ago. And where is the Congress? The invertebrate branch, other than Congressman Jones. And what's so stunning is that you don't need to do archaeological expeditions to find the evidence of the impeachable offense. It's in the front pages. It's openly confessed. Now, many suggest, impeachment sounds like a coup d'etat. Like only banana republics do impeachment. At the Constitutional Convention, Ben Franklin said, no, impeachment is a substitute for assassination to rid yourselves of tyranny. It is a substitute for Brutus and Cassius plotting against Julius Caesar. So it is the civilized way in which we don't impose criminal punishment. It's simply ouster of office. We cannot trust you with the reins of power anymore. That's why it's my judgment, it really is quite obtuse to suggest, to think about impeachment as some kind of revolutionary idea. No, it's the first time to civilianize, to domesticate the kinds of convulsions that typically happen when you've got to change a regime from abuse of power. And what's very odd about the passivity of the Congress, the need for this particular resolution, is that virtually half of the Constitutional Convention, half of the ratification debates at the state level were devoted to the worry and anxiety about having standing armies. We don't want standing armies. In fact, in the Constitution, there's a limit of 2 years on any appropriations for the Defense Department, for the military, in order to force Congress every 2 years to return to the question, do we want a standing army? And that's also, there's a companion idea incorporated in the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms in order to have a well-regulated militia. The reason why there was an obligation for all citizens to participate in the militia is to make a standing army superfluous. That was the idea. And now we have standing armies, trillion-dollar national security expenditures, can't even audit the Pentagon to even know whether the spending was in the 2-year limitation period. And Congress sits quiescent. The most recent, most extravagant usurpation in the history of the entire United States was the Libya war. Open, notorious, we don't want to talk to Congress, we don't report to Congress. And then you have the astonishing testimony of the legal advisor of the State Department, Mr. Harold Coe, formerly a great critic of executive power when he was dean of Yale Law School, And then it's kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but he didn't need a potion, He's there now, the legal advisor at the State Department. And he's testifying as to why Libya and the Tomahawk missiles, the bombings, not a conflict. It's not hostilities within the meaning of the War Powers Act. He says, well, our pilots are at such high altitudes, they're not in danger of being shot down. I said, oh, well, that's a nice analysis. So if we used ICBMs with nuclear warheads to kill and destroy every living, breathing thing in Libya, and we shot the missiles from the United States, no hostilities, right? No war. Our people aren't endangered. You could blow up the whole world, kill 1.5 billion Japanese, no warfare. I mean, is that Orwellian or not? This is the Ministry of Peace and the Ministry of War flipping. And instead of being insulted, the Congress accepts that. Congress accepts that. And before I conclude, I want to explain as well why these simply are not academic ideas that we need to worry about because the rule of law generally becomes inflamed in tatters if it's not complied with scrupulously everywhere. But the consequences of endowing the president with unilateral authority to commence war is disaster, because the presidents go in and fight without even being able to define what victory is. Isn't it truly criminal that we have those brave men and women that Colonel Wilkerson mentioned dying in Afghanistan, and the president and Mr. Holbrooke before his death can't even define victory? They say it's like obscenity. We'll know it when we see it. You're letting people die for something that amorphous, that elusive, that intangible. You don't even know why you're fighting. It's fighting for the sake of fighting. And what are the consequences? Afghanistan, $1 trillion, $350 million a day. Not only do we have staggering expenditures, the killing, the deaths not only of our own men and women, but the civilians and others in Afghanistan, which almost regularly we read in the newspapers. Perhaps they must, maybe, I don't know, Colonel Wilkerson might tell us whether they've now got a new job. For Afghan soldiers, they report to the civilian families who have had their loved ones killed and say, we're apologized for the 88th time. We really didn't mean for you to be collateral damage. Over and over and over again, and then the sincerity seems to rub off since the pattern repeats itself the next day or two. But perhaps even more ultimately dangerous from these fool's errands is that invariably they have what we colloquially call blowback. We create our own enemies. We arm our own enemies. And I think that was explained in yesterday's press conference with regard to Afghanistan. That's one example where we armed, gave money to the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets. Charlie Wilson's war celebrated as how great. The Haqqani faction got money. Hekmatyar got money, arms, and then what happens? They turn and use them on us. You know, the sorcerer's apprentice idea. And these things are inevitable because we can't control the evolution of political dispensations, warfare in other countries, unless we're going to occupy them forever. And so this is not anything unique to Afghanistan. Take Vietnam. You know, all the armaments that we had given to South Vietnam, $4 or $5 billion, we exited. They're the North Vietnam, our enemies. All the arms we sold to the Shah of Iran, what happens? They end up with Ayatollah Khomeini and the mullahs. And we started the shipment of uranium to the Shah. Now we complain, oh, now you're building a nuclear bomb. And if you try to look, well, what are the great beneficial results of presidential interventions? If you measure them against what are obvious consequences on the negative side, it's really hard to find any. It's been said, well, Bosnia was a great example of a success. There were all sorts of internal fighting there between the Serbs and the Croats and the Muslims. There's still troops in Bosnia. This is 17 years after Dayton. The same divisions haven't been mitigated at all. If anything, they're accentuated. So we're supposed to stay there forever? Have we really accomplished anything? In Kosovo, that's another one, supposed to be a great success story. But you still have vicious infighting between a small enclave of Serbs. Some of the Kosovo groups are before the International Criminal Tribunal for war crimes. Have we really accomplished anything that certainly is relevant to the national security of the United States? And I want to close with the example of Libya. Now, all the headlines that we've read about the tragedy of our ambassador being killed in the last few days, and it's all suggested, well, al-Qaeda or somehow misguided forces have gone in and interrupted the perfect democratic evolution that we all were hoping would flower after Gaddafi was removed. But that's not true. I mean, the reason why I was killed precisely because of our intervention. We set the stage for a country that now is semi-anarchic, like Somalia. We destroyed the entire social, cultural infrastructure that at least had some solidity under Gaddafi, and we had no responsibility for it. We go in, destroy everything, and then we can't understand why by spontaneous combustion a new country didn't emerge that loves the United States, and you find George Washingtons and James Madisons everywhere. I mean, it's hallucinogenic is what it is. It's this naive belief that you can take cultures that are very, very primitive political cultures. They're tribal, ethnic cultures. We don't have to necessarily deride or degrade them, but they are outside our ability to turn into democracy, even if that was our role in the world, was to make everyone a carbon copy, a clone of the United States, which it isn't. And the result, what we see, is come back and harms the United States. And again, what is so amazing is we don't have any congressional hearings saying, well, let's make an assessment of what the intervention was about. How come 17 years after the Dayton Accords, there are no congressional hearings saying, was this really worth it? What have we accomplished? Where are we in Kosovo? Nothing. I mean, even now is the time for John Kerry to hold some hearings, again, on Vietnam. Why are we pledging to defend Vietnam against China in the South China Sea? You know, we have a Vietnam War memorial. This was our enemy, the dominoes. Does that suggest there was some errant thinking and maybe we need to be more suspicious of what the executive tells us is the national security imperative? And finally, to me, it almost is an obscenity that we have presidents suggesting that they can go to war without consulting Congress, getting authorization, if they talk to the UN Security Council, the Arab League, Mr. Netanyahu, AIPAC, all these institutions have no accountability to the American people, and that's who he consults? That's who he consults? You know, Congress in that scenario looks like an extra in a Cecil B. DeMille extravaganza. Thanks.
Morning. I'd like to also add my, I don't know what to say other than support, gratitude for Congressman Walter Jones's leadership on this issue. He is taking up this issue at a time super critical to our country, and I don't think people fully understand the magnitude of the challenge or the deficit of leadership in this issue by his colleagues here on the Hill. Let me run through a couple of points. I'm simply an intelligence officer, retired intelligence officer, who believes that their oath of office does not expire with their retirement. And as a private citizen who I feel is informed, with an informed opinion, I'd like to add my voice to everything my colleagues have said today. First, some history. I think we often forget the lessons of history. Trajan, Emperor Trajan, was one of the 5 good emperors of the Roman Empire. And I believe he was a great guy. He did a lot of great things for the Roman Empire, to include, as a good emperor, extending the boundaries of the empire to its greatest extent ever. And in extending those boundaries, even though he did great public works things, he actually died from being ill after one of his last conquests. So if that's good, then I don't want to see bad, because that's what it took in those days. So in many ways, I think we have become similar to that. We threw off the yoke of British imperialism. We were the first colony to break ranks. And yet we have, in many ways, become that which we threw off. And I think this is something we have to consider in the larger context of everything we do. Speaking of King George and the British, there was something called the Star Chamber that existed in the Middle Ages. And one of the great things about the Star Chamber, it was a secret court where facts didn't really matter. It's just whatever the sovereign felt. Geez, wouldn't that be nice if we could just do whatever we wanted based on our feelings? That's where we're at. We have a system of adjudication of assassination at the senior level that allows for the sovereign to do whatever the heck he wants. And oh, by the way, we got lawyers looking at it, so don't worry about it. That should give everybody a really good feeling. Don't worry, I got all my best lawyers telling me why it's okay to do. This is where we're at. And by the generation of this capability in this way, we're creating the next generation of our adversaries. The so-called drone program is an excuse to use military force without an understanding of the second and third order effects. In many ways, and I've talked to some Pakistani colleagues about this, I've talked to the Pakistani media. One of the reporters I spoke to the night said, "Don't you all understand you're creating the next generation of terrorists who are going to come after both our government and your government?" No, apparently we don't. Because we don't have people who understand that the blind use of military force can have secondary effects detrimental to the very objective you're trying to achieve. That's what this is ultimately, in my judgment, all about. The actual rethinking of why we do what we do, when we do, with military force. That's why I'm a strong advocate of H.R. 107. There's no doubt that the president should maintain and retain certain powers relating to the immediate response of threats. I get that, we get that, we're all on board with that. But what we can't have is this endless use of military force when we want to. There's been no debate on the authorized use of military force in any great way since we authorized it in 2001. Why? I think al-Qaeda is pretty much diminished from when it was then, our big adversary. Has it gone away? No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I do believe that al-Qaeda was materially responsible and involved in the assassination of our ambassador, Stevens this past week. With that said, we helped create the circumstance for his death by the fact we destabilized Libya. As much as we may have not liked Muammar Gaddafi, he was essentially the form of Tito. He kept things in check. And as much as I think the Libyan people want to be free, I don't think they were ready by the fact that we've seen a reversion to tribalism, which is the chaos now we see. So again, I don't dispute, we probably had some people at the State Department and the executive branch who had the best intentions without a freaking clue of what they were doing. And that's why Congress must and always be involved in a debate anytime we go to war where it is not necessary. I argue clearly the Libyan war was not necessary to defend the equities and interests of our nation. That is why we must have Congress take an active role, retain an active role. They control the purse strings, as Representative Jones pointed out. And by controlling the purse strings, they must take responsibility of the actions of our government, not just the executive branch, of our government. They fund it. So anytime you have an expenditure of $1, it's like blood money. If you sign off on that, you paid for that. And we're paying for the deaths, as pointed out, of 300,000 people. Think about that. That's like a quarter of the population of Dayton, Ohio, just gone. How is it possible we've not debated this? And more importantly, I've been talking about the Afghan, today is the end of the Afghan surge. Wow, who'd have thought? That was an affectation meant to provide this administration the illusion of making progress. Let's send some troops in there, and we're going to win this. And we're going to pull them out on the... Any strategist will tell you, you never tell the adversary when you're going to deploy and when you're going to withdraw. We did that. We told them what to expect. More importantly, several of us who have criticized the administration based on facts were dismissed. I actually said on one of the cable news networks back in 2009, you got to be, if you're going to do this, you got to go big or go home. If you're going to do counterinsurgency, 500,000 troops for 10 years. That's it. That's the only way you would have success. And oh, by the way, year 11, you leave, chances are it's going to revert back to the way it was, because it's hard to change 2,000 years of cultural momentum. So we have not had the time to look at root causes, because simply we have been trying to use a military solution to issues which, as my colleague Bruce pointed out, some of these cultural disputes go back 2,000, 3,000 years. And you're not going to change it over two using military force. So again, why didn't we have debate on this? Why haven't we looked at this for both, as it makes sense in the American interest to do what we're doing, and frankly, why don't we actually work to try to understand the root causes of the conflicts if we're going to do anything at all? I'm not, this is where there may be some daylight between my colleagues and I. I'm not saying we should sit back and do nothing. I am actually an advocate for special operations and doing things. But again, I would argue we didn't have to do Iraq as an invasion. We could have done other things. We don't have to do a lot of things we do expensively. We can do it much simpler. But again, with oversight. One of the last things I'll close with, and this is always this dispute about, well, we don't want to tell the Congress about what we're doing in the executive branch. Look, there is best practices. I don't want to hear, because the fact is this: I ran operations under the Clinton White House that are still secret, and they were briefed every year to Congress by law. So anytime I hear the executive branch said, oh, we talked over there, it's going to be leaked. No, wrong answer. Some things I think are purposely briefed in such a way to have them leak, to see it kind of float the ball, to see how things will fly with the American people. But I can tell you there are processes in place to keep things completely secret. So that argument does not wash. That's why the Congress must be involved in debate. So as we move out today, as we all go back to our lives, I think it's important to understand how important H.R. 107 is. Not simply because it is something we're saying that if it's passed will have an impeachment potential for the president. It's more important that we use this to bring ourselves back to a point of sanity, a point of understanding, the need for debate, the need to have a reconciliation of our country's actions with our intent, with what we were founded on, with our founding fathers, because there's a huge amount of daylight there between what we are today and what our founding fathers intended us to be. Thank you.
I'd just like to make two additional points before we open the floor for questions and discussion. First of all, there was to be another speaker here this morning, but he unfortunately had to be back out on the West Coast for urgent business and asked me instead to read a brief statement. This is General Joseph P. Hoare, retired Marine four-star general who was both Chief of Staff and then was Chief of Staff and later Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Central Command. What he said briefly is, in their great wisdom, our founding fathers gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new U.S. Constitution, gave the sole authority to declare war to the U.S. Congress. Having just waged a successful revolution to free themselves from the British monarchy, our founders understood that it was essential to secure a representative form of Republican self-government, that the power to declare war must be in the hands of the Congress and not in the executive branch. They were committed to preventing any form of monarchy or dictatorship. Nothing has transpired in the intervening centuries to justify any alteration in their wise decision. Under our federal Constitution, only the Congress has the power to declare war, and that must remain a cardinal principle. In recent decades, we have seen an erosion of that constitutional principle, and I fully concur that this erosion must be halted and reversed. There are copies of General Hoar's statement over here on the table. The final point I would like to make, apart from the fact that clearly everything that has been said by Congressman Jones and all of the other speakers, including the fact that impeachment should not be considered a four-letter word, but is something that was, again, a critical issue among the founders as a way of dealing with the problems of out-of-control executive tyranny. I want to point out one additional matter that I think is something else that there's a tendency to be basically tone deaf on here in Washington. All of the previous speakers have cited the Libya war as an illegal action that has caused an enormous amount of blowback. The Libya war was also viewed as a strategic turning point in both Moscow and China. We've seen this in the fact that the Russians and the Chinese have vetoed every action at the UN Security Council that might even remotely suggest that we're about to enter into a replay of Libya in Syria. And in particular, both the top military leadership in Russia and China have warned that we're not simply facing the danger of constitutional erosion or regional wars, but that if these situations continue in the direction that they're going, we could very well find ourselves stumbling into a situation of general war involving countries that still operate under the doctrine of MAD and still have arsenals of thermonuclear weapons. In fact, in February of this year, the then president of Russia, about to be replaced, Mr. Medvedev, was speaking at a conference in St. Petersburg with Attorney General Holder seated on the dais right behind him, and explicitly warned that any attempts to carry out further regime change outside the framework of the UN Security Council would be seen as an attempt to fundamentally overhaul and overturn the entire system under which the world has avoided general war since the end of World War II. And he said, God forbid we could find ourselves facing thermonuclear war and thermonuclear extinction. So we're on the very precipice of a danger of wars breaking out in the Middle East, where there are potentialities for this to go much further than anybody particularly desires, and we could find ourselves facing a prospect of general war. Many of the events that are playing out right now are sorely reminiscent of the kinds of deals and backroom agreements and alliances that immediately preceded World War I. The main difference between then and now is that in the eruption point of World War I, there were not yet nuclear weapons. So I just want to underscore the points that have made by all of my colleagues here on the podium, that what we are dealing with here is a grave crisis that cannot in any way, shape, or form be underestimated. And again, I think it's appropriate to thank Congressman Jones for taking the stand that he's taken and putting the war danger and the issue of impeachment on the table so that this is once again seen as a universal principle for restoring our Constitution and hopefully avoiding a general war that could get completely out of control. So if the speakers are available to continue and take some questions?
Yeah.
Great.